Welcome to the News Roundup for Tuesday, January 6, 2026. I'm Bill Thomas, and here's what's happening right now. Shocking new allegations revealing that Governor Tim Walz received large sums of money from a number of Somali donors who run questionable daycare centers in Minnesota. Fresh details emerge concerning Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's substantial role in allowing fraudsters to steal billions of dollars in taxpayer money from her state's coffers. And President Trump launching a massive federal investigation into California's finances following a new report claims that fraud, waste, and abuse in the Golden State could eventually top $250 billion. Also, Iran's leaders are hatching an escape plan as growing protests threaten to topple the Islamic regime. And get this, Hannibal Lecter buys the former home of a Hollywood power couple after losing his previous crib in last year's devastating Palisades fire here in the LA area. All this and a bunch more coming up right now on the Big Roundup. We have a great deal to get to today, and we begin here. Governor Tim Walz may not be running for re-election anymore, but the colossal fraud scandal, which is plaguing his administration, refusing to go away. And now investigators have followed the money trail directly to the Minnesota governor's doorstep. According to a shocking new report, over the years, a number of people who operate highly questionable Somali-run daycare centers have made sizable personal contributions to Walz's prior gubernatorial campaigns. The report claims the governor received a total of nearly $10,000 in combined contributions from the individuals and goes on to point out that their alleged business operations, they all took painstaking efforts to make themselves appear legitimate despite evidence to the contrary. The accusations leveled at the contributors include claims that some of the people involved ran multiple organizations simultaneously, which received taxpayer-funded state payments, even though they had no digital footprints at all and were allegedly located in unusual locations, things like crumbling strip malls or even run-down private homes. It all sounds kind of creepy. Furthermore, when these mom-and-pop organizations were ultimately investigated, the state's Department of Human Services cited several of them for failing to live up to the most basic professional standards, including a number of incidents related to the extremely poor care of patients. That's the best-case scenario. According to the report, one company recently admitted they had no skilled caregivers available at all, and the list goes on and on. In the meantime, as can be expected, the White House has finally had more than enough of Walz's antics, and they say now the governor is responsible for turning the land of 10,000 lakes into the land of 10,000 Somali schemes. That's got to sting just a little bit. They also say that at a minimum, President Trump personally believes the governor is criminally liable for both his alleged bungling of the fraud scandal as well as his pitiful attempt to get it under control. As a result, they say 47 has now ordered the Justice Department to finally get to the bottom of the matter and once and for all. In the meantime, Governor Walz refusing to go down without a fight. That's fine, but he'll be Mike Tyson in last year's Jake Paul beatdown. Not going to be pretty. He says Minnesotans are currently under assault by a petty and vile administration, that he's going to spend his remaining time in office trying to make things better, and that it's now time for his Republican rivals to put up or shut up. They're going to put up when it comes to their attempt to turn him into the bad guy. Hey, look, Republicans didn't do that. Mr. Walz did that all on his own. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. At the very least, when you're a sitting governor and campaign donations, they start pouring in, usually kind of a good idea to know who's writing the check and maybe even why. In other words, are people ponying up the dough in exchange for some kind of favor? And I think they call that one quid pro quo. Now, perhaps this is an honest mistake, and maybe he truly didn't know where the big bucks were coming from, but the metrics, they don't look good. $10,000 worth of greenbacks finding a place in the campaign coffer speaks poorly to how to well manage a legitimate campaign. At the very least, he should be at least mildly embarrassed. Here at the Big News Roundup, we understand it's a bit cumbersome to account for every dollar that comes into the Walz gubernatorial love lounge, but, with just a bit of detective work, it can't be that difficult to figure out who's doing the funding, and even easier to determine if the money is a donation, a bribe, or something else altogether. Pay no attention to me. I'm just thinking out loud. The way I see it, the governor of any U.S. state is the chief executive officer of that state. And if the CEO can't even oversee the management of a campaign, then how can he be trusted to run the entire state? Fortunately, two-term Minnesota Governor Tim Walz won't be returning for Act 3. He'll not be running for a third term as the honest, forthright, and talented governor. And that means that, well, the Timinator has just been exterminated. Turning now to a deeper look at another hot-winded politician who's desperately treading water when it comes to obscuring her ties to members of the Somali community, directly linked to Minnesota's staggering welfare fraud scandal. As you may be aware, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar recently revealed an enormous and rather sudden one-year leap in her own personal net worth. Yeah, I kind of wonder how that happened as well. Not coincidentally, she's also personally responsible for launching the bill which expanded federal funding for her state's pandemic-era food and child care programs, basically opening the floodgates to her district's Somali-linked schemes, which are at the very heart of the entire fraud scandal itself. In a nutshell, Omar used the threat of the pandemic to convince her fellow lawmakers on Capitol Hill to back a measure which would allow state governments to increase their welfare payouts, all while simultaneously removing any federal oversight concerning the requirements to qualify for those programs. It's a pretty good trick if you can get away with it. And even better if you can somehow wind up with a net worth of $30 million when it's all said and done. That takes a little bit of talent. In the meantime, despite revelations that her state's Feeding Our Future program was scammed by dozens of criminals to the tune of more than $250 million, making it the largest pandemic-era fraud case in our nation, Omar is still standing by her initial measure and claiming it did much more good than harm because it ultimately fed a number of hungry children. And no word on whether or not those hungry children are related to the dozens of alleged scammers of Somali origin who arguably profited from their outlandish schemes. Raising eyebrows just a little bit further, a number of people personally linked to Omar herself, including a few contributors to her previous congressional campaigns, have already pleaded guilty for their roles in scamming their states out of millions of dollars in taxpayer money. In case you're not aware, their schemes were directly related to the expanded food programs, which Omar herself went to bat for on Capitol Hill. Look, feel free to connect the dots yourself, and when you're done doing that, chime in and leave us a comment. Tell us what you're thinking. Meanwhile, now beginning to appear as if Somali-linked scams are even more prevalent and widespread than we previously thought. For example, it's just been revealed that a couple of Somali-run nonprofit organizations in both Minnesota and Ohio, which each receive significant grant money from the federal government, they actually used a questionable Somali-run accounting firm to perform their required audits. Not surprisingly, the companies each received glowing reports from the accountants, imagine that, despite debatable tax forms, allegations of potential fraud, and questions concerning the legality of the audits themselves. Hey, by the way, as a result of what's going on, the Trump administration now deploying 2,000 additional ICE and Homeland Security agents to the Twin Cities area. It's part of their federal crackdown on illegal immigration and, transnational crime. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. For the most part, in every facet of life, there's oversight. Members of law enforcement, for example, they wear those body cameras. In the medical industry, you got the nurses, doctors, surgeons, and all the rest. They have someone to answer to. It's called accountability. It's good business, and it just makes good common sense. By and large, accountability is there. It's in place to keep everyone on the straight and narrow, but they do things a little bit differently in Minnesota's 5th District. All beginning to look like the Congresswoman intentionally created the perfect crime. Sounds like she pulled the covers over the oversight. And regardless of whether or not she did it for personal gain, she appears to be at the very least an enabler. With nobody watching the company store, a number of people made off with a boatload of dough. The groups they were charged with supporting received little, if anything. And while dozens of people have been convicted in Omar's district, the architect behind the Meals Act still claims she had no knowledge of the big heist. Now, in her defense, I'll give her this. Casino owners, they never know when Danny Ocean and his pals are going to do a job either. So there's that. Investigations are still ongoing. The money, long gone, and each of us as taxpayers, we're on the hook, left to pick up the tab with absolutely nothing to show for it. I'll switch things up just a bit now and pivot to a new report called Califradia, which claims that all the fraud, waste, and abuse, which is currently taking place in Gavin Newsom's California, that's my California as well, by the way, I'm right here in town, could ultimately top out at, check this out, more than 250 billion clams. According to the new analysis, a number of scammers and criminals have been intentionally and systematically looting a variety of the Golden State's agencies for years. And among the areas it claims are all rife with abuse: the state's Medicaid health care program, the CalFresh food stamp program, and the state agency dealing with housing and homelessness. The authors of the report, they also claim there's widespread abuse currently plaguing California's K-12 education system, as well as the state's community college program, which they say is overrun by fake student loan applications. Additionally, the report goes on to point its finger directly at the staggeringly high cost of recent unemployment insurance scams, saying that during the pandemic era alone, California lost more than $50 billion to low-life grifters. Now, ultimately, the report blames California's Governor Gavin Newsom for single-handedly ruining the Golden State, with the author claiming that 16 straight years of one-party rule by Democrats has created an epic culture of corruption and a staggering tolerance for mismanagement and incompetence. But outside of that, California is just swell. Goes on to call for a thorough and complete top-to-bottom audit of every single California state agency in question, and also urges the Justice Department to step in and investigate the situation for themselves. President Trump seems to agree with their findings, now claims that Newsom is even more corrupt than all of Minnesota combined, and that a federal fraud investigation of California, it is right now. It's currently underway. In the meantime, Newsom's team claims the new report is nothing more than a bunch of made-up MAGA nonsense. They say that ever since taking office, their governor has already blocked more than $125 billion worth of fraud, and that he's hard at work protecting taxpayers from the kind of scammers which Trump regularly pardons. And again, I'm just thinking out loud, but I wonder if his team just deflected. It sort of kind of sounds like it. Final thought, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. Important to point out that while the state of Minnesota has had a starring role on the big News Roundup right here over the past several days, they certainly don't hold a patent on fraud. And by some accounts, the problem could be tons worse, exponentially worse, in Gavin Newsom's Golden State. Yeah, California. If the claims are true, then tons of folks are getting a boatload of freebies. Now, free to them, but not free to the taxpayers, like me, a Californian, who are funding someone else's scam-riddled lifestyle. Calling for an audit this late in the game, that's far too little and way too late. A system of checks and balances should be perpetually in motion. And when it's not, it's the same as putting a 4-year-old kid in charge of the cookie jar. The jar filled to the brim with Oreos and chocolate chip cookies. And I'm kind of hungry. The amount of alleged fraud in my home state right here in California, astronomical, inexcusable, and absolutely unforgivable. People put their trust in local, county, and state officials to account for every last nickel of taxpayer funds. And when those funds are poorly managed, you got to hold someone accountable. And that someone this time is California Governor Newsom. Now, we're taking the time to share this story with you because we assume, like us, you're as disgusted by fraud and waste and abuse. And a reminder, by all accounts, this Governor Newsom fella, right now, he has his eyes on the big prize, and he wants nothing more than to become your next president. Governor Gavin Newsom, he destroyed California, and with the help of his fellow Democrats, if he lays claim to the White House in 2028, he could destroy the rest of the country as well. All right, change things up just a bit now. Turn our attention to the latest effort by Communist China to turn ordinary cargo ships into potential weapons of mass destruction. Very important. Listen up. According to a new report, China now outfitting a number of older, medium-sized freighters with makeshift electromagnetic catapult systems so they can secretly launch modern combat drones without attracting too much fanfare. The report goes on to say that by hiding their drones on a number of cheap cargo vessels, the communist regime is hoping to fly under the radar, disguise their maneuvers, and rely on a bare-bones skeleton crew to run the entire show. Hey, look, we keep warning you, China right now, they are the one to watch. It also warns that these types of container ships are plentiful, relatively small, I imagine affordable as well, and easy to camouflage in the world's shipping lanes, potentially creating a significant headache for anyone in the world who's tasked with trying to stop them. Now, some additional headlines we are keeping a very close watch on here in the News Roundup newsroom. And first up, the Trump administration announcing plans now to pull the plug on nearly $10 billion in federal funding for social service programs in 5 Democrat-led states, claiming that New York, California, my home base, also Illinois, Colorado, and, of course, Minnesota are all overrun by fraud. Moving along, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis now calling for a significant overhaul of his state's property tax regulations, saying that longtime homeowners should no longer be treated as ATM machines by their local governments. And on the international front, Iran's government now says they're willing to pay their citizens $7 a month as they aim to ease growing protests over the country's dire economic situation. 7 clams, very generous. In the meantime, Iran's supreme leader reportedly has already made plans to flee to Russia if those protests ultimately lead to the downfall of his decades-old Islamic regime. And now a quick gander at a bit of rock and roll showbiz news, and we kick things off today with the spectacular comeback of a high-kicking pop music legend, the one and only David Lee Roth, now ending his years-long retirement, heading back out on the road for a series of at least 30 concerts, if he holds up, with his nationwide tour currently set to kick off in the state of Washington just a few months from right now. Like, I'm a big Van Halen fan, and in his day, nobody rocked the planet better than David Lee Roth, and I'm going to sign off on the new tour, but with one very small, almost not even worth mentioning caveat. Please use a stunt double for the vocals. Thing is, Diamond Dave, he is the life of the party. He's tons of fun, but I've heard him vocalizing lately, and I'm trying to be gentle, but his best days as a lead singer sort of kind of behind him. He's not a kid anymore. It kind of happens. Hey, speaking of rockers who are long past their prime, a number of fans now reaching out and expressing shock and dismay that several of their favorite classic rock supergroups have still not made it into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And among the neglected legends, Boston, Styx, also Emerson, Lake, and Palmer, and a bunch more. Don't know about ELP, but I'll tell you, Styx absolutely belongs in the Hall of Fame. Their songs and their albums, their live performances, legendary. The live shows just can't be beat. They're otherworldly. Also, Boston had a great run. To my knowledge, they're still together, and they always sound brilliant. And by the way, I demand that Weird Al also be inducted into the Hall as well. And in Hollywood, an Academy Award-winning actor who's best known for playing a fava bean-eating serial killer has just plunked down $13 million for a luxurious new crib. Hannibal Lecter himself, he also is known as Sir Anthony Hopkins to normal folks like you and I, lost his former house when it burned to the ground in last year's Palisades fire right here in the LA area, Southern California. He'll soon be moving into a sprawling compound, which at one time did belong to actors Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell. Yeah, $13 million sounds like a ton of dough for 5 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms, but when you break it down, you do the math, kind of amortize everything, comes down to only $1.3 million per room. Now, by LA standards, that's pretty affordable. Also, with 6,400 square feet, you'll have tons of places to wolf down those tasty fava beans and wash it all down with a nice big bottle of Chianti. Pranav the Magnificent, if you would please.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
That kind of creeps me out, that movie. I kind of like it, but it kind of creeps me out. And now time to call it a wrap on the big news roundups. Have an awesome day today. Stay safe. And if you haven't done so already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button right over there. And with that, we're going to dim the lights. Now we'll fade to black, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow. We'll have a brand new edition for you, a brand new episode of the Big News Roundup.